Hello boys and girls, welcome back to chapter 7 of Mr. Mousey, Beyond the Silver Sea, an Adventure. Well, where did we leave Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit off before? Well, they had just got back from their wild flight from the wolves in the wildland and had discovered that the carpet was a flying carpet and that they were up in the air, and Mr. Rabbit fell off and was rescued by Kirak the gull. So they're back at the dale now and have found in the satchel the book that Mr. Owl has sent them, delivered by Kirak the seagull. So this is chapter 7 and it's called Preparations. Somewhere in the back of Mr. Rabbit's head was the knowledge that they weren't about to be heading home until quite a few more things had happened to them, but he had managed up to now to avoid the sure truth of this by holding on to a few hopes. These included some rather poor ones that, if he had taken 5 seconds to examine, wouldn't have even convinced himself. For example, floating about towards the rear and generally fuzziest part of his brain was the idea that he had left his back lawn uncut and it would need attention. Well, since Mr. Rabbit had never cut the grass in his back garden, in that he neither owned a lawnmower nor the inclination to use one, it would have been a very difficult argument to defend. Mr. Rabbit had a very nice front garden, of course, but it was entirely taken up with vegetables. The back garden was a bit of a, well, let's just say the word tidy was never used in connection with Mr. Rabbit's back garden. Another vain hope he had harboured was the idea that Mr. Mousey would just forget all about the rescue idea and just go home. This was a very fuzzy hope indeed, and to be honest, an almost completely last-ditch one. His secret weapon of a hope was the one that was based on something Owl had said when they were visiting him. You see, Owl had seemed a little bit surprised that Mr. Mousey and he had started on their journey without the book. He seemed to think that they would need it as their adventure unfurled. Going back for the book meant going home. Having the book delivered sort of knocked that hope flat on its back, going out the back door with its toes pointed towards the ceiling. So, what now? Mr. Rabbit asked his pal, who had opened the book and was turning the pages. He waited to hear if the mouse used any of the words let's or go or home, and preferably in that order. "Look at this!" exclaimed the excited voice of the mouse. "It's changed! There's more in the book!" Mr. Mousey had the book opened upon the carpet, and so Mr. Rabbit leaned over to see what the excitement was. What he saw made his eyes open wide in interest. The page Mr. Mousey had turned to was the picture of the two of them peering into the oak. The page opposite had previously been blank. Now it was filled in elegant text. "What's it say, Mr. Mousey? Is it about us?" Mr. Mousey nodded his head. "Yes, it is indeed. All about our trek to the tree, and listen, I'll read you some." He began to read the words off the page. "Verily the first stage of their adventure was a long one, all done on foot, carrying their provisions on their backs and their courage in their hearts." Is that what it says? Courage and all that? Questioned the highly impressed Rabbit. "I like this book. Read some more." Mr. Mousey continued and read some more. Over hill and dale they battled, the mouse leading, the rabbit covering their rear, his highly attuned ears alert to any sound of danger. "It makes us sound really important, doesn't it?" asked Mr. Rabbit. "Well, our quest is an important one, Mr. Rabbit," replied his pal, and you are a very important part of it." "Is there any more?" asked the rabbit. Well, there was quite a bit more on that page, all of which concerned their travel to the tree. It read in very grand fashion. Mr. Mousey got to the end and turned the page to see what else, if any, there was. The illustration on the following page was so vivid, so dramatic, that both Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit recoiled at the sight. The page was titled Chapter 3, The Flight for Life. In it, the foreground was filled with the fleeing shapes of the two of them, with looks of grim determination mixed with fear on their faces. Behind them, the artist had drawn 4 grotesque and scrawny wolves, their teeth bared. The hair on their necks was raised, foam was flying from their mouths, their eyes ablaze with a hideous light. "4!" cried Mr. Rabbit. "The brutes had us outnumbered 2 to 1. Mr. Mousey was reading again. "In the chase from the ancient oak, any other creatures would soon have been caught and devoured. But not for nothing had the 2 been chosen. No pack of crude wolves on the hunt was going to catch these heroes that day." Mr. Mousey read aloud the remainder of that chapter before turning over to the next. Chapter 4, Lifted to the Clouds. This time the picture showed the 2 of them on the carpet with the woods and hills far below. Mr. Mousey read parts of this chapter also, and like the others, it was an exciting read. "I like that bit where Kerouac and his chums rescued me," said Mr. Rabbit at last. "Although I'm being rescued, it doesn't make me seem foolish at all." "Foolish? Of course you're not, you silly old rabbit," cried his friend. "A bit dopey sometimes, but never foolish." He laughed with a twinkle in his eye that Mr. Rabbit caught, and it made him laugh as well. Is that it all then?" he said, still grinning. They turned over the page and found another chapter. Chapter 5, The Silvery Sea, it proclaimed. In the picture to the left, the 2 of them were once again riding the carpet, but this time silvery, glistening waves sped by beneath them. Flying fish were leaping out of the water, and Mr. Mousey was pointing to something far off, just out of the picture. They looked as if they were moving very fast. Some of the text in the right-hand page was filled in this time. Mr. Mousey again read it out loud. "To the southwest they sped, seeking out sign of the land across the sea, the land where next their journey lay." He stopped reading. "And?" said the rabbit. "That's it," said the mouse. Back to us again, I guess." We better get started then, eh?" said Mr. Rabbit. You see, somehow the way things read in the magical book had persuaded him that this was a mission, and he was very much in it. Also, it was going to be more than a day or 2 outing, and since that was that, they may as well get on with it. Mr. Mousey looked hesitantly at his chum. "You're sure? This could turn out to be a long and dangerous adventure. We can't tell what perils may yet lie ahead, and there's no guarantee that we'll even be successful." He himself had determined they ought to carry on, but he didn't want to force anyone else into following, especially not his best friend in the whole world. Mr. Rabbit shook his head slowly. "Now, if I don't go, who on earth is going to stop you from getting yourself killed, or something far worse?" He knew now that there was no way he was going to let his friend head off on his own. "Anyway," he continued, "an adventure like this, once begun, is best finished at its end." Often fear grows more easily where there's doubt and indecision. Now that Mr. Rabbit found himself fully committed to all that lay ahead, he found that the fear that had constantly been plaguing him had already withered to a very much smaller weed than before. It was as if the sun had eventually broken out and banished the lurking gloom. Even the day seemed brighter, and not again during the rest of their journey did he express the idea of giving up, even when all other hopes had seemed to fail. The sun was well into her circuit by now. The birds were singing, the river babbling merrily, as they sat down and planned their next stage. The book, at least, was a bit of an aid in that it gave a general direction in which to head. "The silvery sea," read Mr. Mousey once more. "That'll be the far-off glinting I saw when we were high on the carpet this morning. Did you see it?" "Actually, no," replied the rabbit. "I may have been busy, plummeting to my death at the time. And if you mean later on, after my rescue, I was too busy not plummeting." What he meant was that he was too interested in staying on the carpet to be noticing much else. "Oh, yes, I suppose so. Well, I noticed a shimmering far off to the southwest, over the river and away beyond the wildlands." "Beyond? Is that beyond as in nowhere near and very far away from?" asked the rabbit hopefully. "Oh, it seemed very far away indeed," agreed the mouse. "But I think I could find the general direction all right." He pulled his compass from the top pocket of his rucksack and fiddled with the dial. Holding it flat, he studied the face. This was a mystery to Mr. Rabbit, and pointed with his arm over the river. Actually, generally in the direction they had gone the day previously, perhaps a little bit more south. "About that way," he declared. Well, the two of them spent the next couple of hours tidying up, discussing plans and preparing for leaving. Mr. Rabbit still had a fair amount of food, and Mr. Mousey had 2 canteens of water which he refilled from the river. When he returned from filling them, he was looking very pleased with himself. "Nice grin," said Mr. Rabbit, looking up. "Is it for something in particular, or just a grin you had lying around somewhere?" Mr. Mousey brought his arms round from behind his back. Ta-da! He was holding 2 fair-sized trout, one in each hand. "Wow! Where did they come from?" "The river," came back the reply. "I managed to catch them as they leapt over the stones in the shallows." It was decided worthwhile to spend some time cooking the fish and saving the meat for the trip ahead. Since their little fire from the morning had not yet been put out, it was a simple matter of adding a few more dried birch twigs and cooking the fish on a pan over the fire. They ate some as they waited on them cooling when they were done. "These scrumptious," said the rabbit, licking his paws. Well, the fire out and everything now packed and ready to go, they prepared their carpet for flight. Mr. Mousey reckoned that it would be quite windy as they sped through the air, so they placed their packs at the very front of the carpet to act as a windbreak. Between the two of them, he placed the satchel containing the book, and they sat down either side. Again, Mr. Mousey took the left and Mr. Rabbit the right, and thus seated, they prepared to fly. "Ready?" That was Mr. Mousey. "Ready," replied the rabbit. "Final check." They both looked around the carpet and to their campsite to ensure nothing had been left behind. "Check," nodded Mr. Rabbit. "Take grip," said Mr. Mousey, using their agreed words of command. "Grip taken," affirmed Mr. Rabbit. "Up 10%, instructed the mouse. 10%, repeated the rabbit. You see, because it was important that both of them raised and lowered the edges of the carpet by the same amount, Mr. Mousey had struck on the method of using percentage. It was about the only way either could think to coordinate their movements. They had spent some time that afternoon working out the details, and one way or the other they were about to find out if that was going to work. If someone's side rose a little or too much, Mr. Mousey would correct the imbalance by adjusting his side. Slowly, so very slowly, the carpet rose. It rose slightly higher on Mr. Rabbit's side, so Mr. Mousey lifted his edge a tiny bit more and the carpet levelled. "Up 20%, called Mr. Mousey. Now the carpet began to rise with a bit more of a serious will. When they had reached an altitude of about 100 feet above the ground, Mr. Mousey spoke again. "All level." "Level," came back the words of his flying companion, nervous, but glad they weren't going to anywhere near the height they had been at earlier. They now adjusted their positions so that they were once again lying on their stomachs, unable to see directly over the packs, but having a superb view either side. To move forward, they both had to grasp the large tassels at the front corners of the carpet, and having both taken a good grip each, Mr. Mousey gave out the next instruction. "Forward 1/3. Now, so as not to get the up and the forward commands confused, it was actually Mr. Rabbit's idea to use something different for forward motion. Using the tassels like a lever, they both pushed their own one forward 1/3. The carpet accelerated smoothly and swiftly forward. Their speed was hard to work out for sure, but Mr. Mousey guessed they were moving about the speed of a cantering horse. At this rate of going, Mr. Mousey reckoned that they may need to put some finer control in for forward movement, but for now they were still very much beginners and had a lot to learn. But one thing they had discovered was this. This was fun! Now, steering was more a matter of leaning and tilting yourself in the direction you wanted to go, and as they went along, they managed to more or less get the hang of it. The river was already far behind, it having been crossed within seconds of taking off from the dell. Now they were skirting over the harsh landscape of the wildlands, and from 100 feet up its size could be better appreciated. It was clear that they had actually not penetrated that deeply into it. It ran on, countless similar hills and valleys, sparsely populated with the odd tree and stream. Paths, however, crisscrossed the most of the heath. Mr. Mousey wondered who had made them and where they went. In front of him, Mr. Mousey had placed his compass, and after a few adjustments to their course, they steadied on a south-southwest bearing. The carpet maintained a constant height above the land. Where a hill appeared, the carpet would rise over it. Where a valley fell below them, it would dip and follow its contours. "Now this is what I call adventuring!" cried the rabbit, who had forgotten all about his fear of the carpet. "Walking! Ha! Walking is for the birds!" "Look," said the mouse, pointing ahead. "Look! Can you see it now?" Sure enough, when he cast his gaze ahead, Mr. Rabbit could see on the horizon, still some distance off, but undeniably there, a thin, shimmering line of silver. Mr. Mousey was crying out with glee, "Silvery sea, here we come!" Well, that's the end of that chapter, boys and girls. The next chapter, well, we find out what it's like when they get to the sea. I hope you enjoyed that. Take care, and we'll see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.